Hey TYT, I'm Nomiki Konst, here with a special guest today, straight from Greece. We have Giannis Vαρουφάκης, who is the author of Adults in the Room. You may remember him from his motorcycle trips across Europe, fighting the EU establishment, fighting for democracy. Well, he is here in New York to talk about his experiences working on behalf of the Greek government during the debt crisis. And he has a new book out. He's also the founder of the DM25 movement, the Democracy in Europe movement, and we're very grateful to have you.
I'm very pleased to be here.
So I don't even know where to begin, because the past couple of years have been so shocking to neoliberalism, right? Globally. So I guess I'll start with this. Is neoliberalism dead?
Yes. But it's important to define what neoliberalism is. Let's not conflate it with capitalism or financialization. Neoliberalism is an ideology. It was the ideology that sprang out in the late 1970s, in Britain with Margaret Thatcher, here with Ronald Reagan. The idea that markets are not only good instruments, but also they're ends in themselves. Mm-hmm. But exactly like Marxism was an ideology which had no real connection with the Soviet Union, but was used by the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in order to justify everything that they were doing for their own purposes. Similarly, neoliberalism became, if you want, the ideological cover for the excesses of the financial sector, for liberalizing finance, for creating financialization, and in the end, for cynically shifting all the losses of the financiers after 2008 onto the shoulders of the weakest citizens.
So Greece was in one of the worst positions after the
Greece was the
financial
Lehman
collapse.
Brothers of Europe, except that it was a country, not a company. With a company, you shut it down, people lose their jobs, it's pretty tragic, but it's not a calamity. When you have a small nation of 10 million people, as you well know, that goes bankrupt, and you treat them even more harshly than Lehman Brothers was treated. Because effectively what the Greek Prime Minister in 2010 was told when he went to his creditors and said, we are bankrupt, is no bailout for you, no real bailout, no genuine bailout, and you're not allowed to go bankrupt either. You're not allowed to default, because the French and the German banks that had lent the Greek state were already insolvent, and another hit of 200 billion would have been impossible for them to sustain without the German and the French and the Italian taxpayers bailing them out again, second time in 1 year. In the end, just to cut a long story short, what we had was a crime against logic. The largest loan in human history was given to the most bankrupt state in Europe on conditions of austerity, swingeing austerity that has never been seen before, except for Puerto Rico today, that guaranteed the shrinking of the income, which was not enough to pay for the old debts, and now it would have to cover for the new debts. So a 10-year-old can tell you that this is not going to end well. And therefore, Greece entered into the longest Great Depression in the history of the world. And we're still in that situation. But Greece, except for the Greeks, shouldn't matter. The reason why it remains in the news for such a long time is because it is, if you want, the canary in the mine. It reminds us of the faulty architecture, firstly, of the European Union's economy, and secondly, of international globalized capitalism.
When the idea of the European Union began, what was the debate? Was there a debate?
The European Union began as a combination of two phenomena. One was the genuine urge of Europeans not to repeat another war, which is a genuine and authentic and, I believe, very worthy aspiration that the Europeans had in the 1950s, late 1940s and early 1950s. But there was a second phenomenon, a second element to that made the European Union a reality. It was an American plan. It was planned and implemented by the New Dealers in power in Washington, D.C. It was part of a plan to extend Roosevelt's New Deal to the Western world. It was a Bretton Woods system. It was debated in the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944. And that plan was alive and well for 20 years, up until the Nixon shock, 15th of August 1971, ended it. And indeed, it was the golden era of capitalism. The baby boomers experienced a period of steady growth, certainty, low inflation, more or less constant interest rates at around 4%, no fluctuations in interest rates, and a serious shrinking in inequality. But that system died in 1971, and then we had the brave new world after that.
I think what's so confusing to young people in particular, looking back on history and saying, okay, well, this idea was brought to you by fairly progressive, if you look back in history, fairly progressive related to today, forces in America, the New Deal. And then a Republican got caught in a corruption scandal, and then we became more conservative? What was this evolution? How did it go into neocons and neoliberal philosophy when it was so clear that the progressive forces were the ones that were bringing prosperity, and then the conservative corruption is what ended that?
Maybe it's because I'm an economist, but I tend to explain those dramatic shifts in political dynamics from an economic perspective. The way I understand it is, think about it. Once Bretton Woods was established, the New Deal was extended beyond the borders of the United States. The Republicans who came into power, like Eisenhower, completely adopted the New Deal. They never challenged the very basis of the New Deal. The difference between Democrats and Republicans, they were minor compared to today. But then the Bretton Woods system collapsed. And the reason why it collapsed had nothing to do with politics. It had to do with economics. It collapsed because that global system that America had created for the post-war era, the golden era of capitalism, was predicated upon America taking a large chunk of American profits, surpluses that it had because it was, in effect, the only exporting country in the 1950s. The rest of the Western world was in smithereens after the Second World War. The only country that exported and manufactured goods was the United States. So they had a surplus, a trade surplus. They took about 70% of that trade surplus and very intelligently sent it back to Europe and to Japan in the form of the Marshall Aid Plan and other ways of looking after, nurturing the European Union and the Japanese economy, not out of philanthropy, but because they understood that the only way you can maintain your own surplus is if you take part of it and you reinvest it in the deficit region so that they can afford to buy your stuff. So what ended this and brought us neoliberalism? My theory is very simple. America lost its surplus. It slipped into a deficit position. By the mid to late 1960s, America had become a deficit country. It was a combination of the Vietnam War, the fact that German and Japanese factories had become far more efficient than American factories were, and even the Great Society program of LBJ, which was very important in this country for lowering poverty. Nevertheless, it sapped a portion of that surplus. So by the end of the 60s, the global system, which was based on American surpluses, collapsed because American surplus is just like the pillar of the building having fallen. And then something remarkable happened in the 1970s. It took about six or 7 years. And remember, this was a period, 1970s, when American wages, median wages, real wages, stopped growing, and they have never caught up with that level. Now, what happened then was really very interesting. There was a crucial exchange between Henry Kissinger and Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker at the time, that was well before he became chairman of the Fed, was an advisor to Henry Kissinger. And there was a very interesting debate that I read somewhere, I have a transcript of it, in which Kissinger, being Kissinger, asked the poignant question, how can we retain our world hegemony now that we're a deficit country? Because usually empires, when they go into deficit, they lose their hegemony. And the answer that people like Paul Volcker gave was, well, it doesn't really matter whether we have a surplus or a deficit, as long as we are the ones who recycle global surpluses. And come to think of it, the American model, which obtained between the 1970s and 2008, is a very interesting, unique one in the history of the world. The American economy operated as a huge vacuum cleaner that was sucking into the territory of the United States the exports of Germany, of Holland, of Japan, later of China. Yeah? Constant increases in the trade deficit of the United States. So instead of panicking that suddenly the United States was a deficit country, the authorities didn't mind accelerating that deficit and making it grow. But somebody has to pay for it. Because if you are increasingly in deficit, somebody has to cover that deficit. And the remarkable thing was that it was paid for by turning Wall Street into the magnet that was attracting about 70% of global profits. So other people's surpluses were being recycled through Wall Street, and this was a very nice recycling loop. So my estimation is that for about 25 years, 30 years, about $5 billion net was being recycled through Wall Street every day. So this tsunami of capital, when you give bankers $5 billion a day to play with, do you know what they do? They find ways of making it work for them. Exactly. So derivatives were built on top of them. So there is this torrent of capital coming into Wall Street. Keeping American wages low and pushing them further down was an important incentive for foreign capital to come into the United States. So the immiseration of the working class and the buying out of the working class by giving them more credit, not wages, was important to attract the capital. And then the bankers started playing tricks and building bets and toxic derivatives on the back of this. So financialization was essential in this new hegemonic role of the United States. Now, in 2008, those pyramids of money that the financiers created just burned down, and that model broke down. So the problem we have in the world, not just in the United States or in Greece or in Europe, is that for the first time after the Second World War, the United States economy was no longer capable of balancing out global capital, global capitalism. So we are in a state of permanent crisis after 2008 because nobody's minding the shop globally. No one is balancing out the flows of trade and capital. The Bretton Woods system was doing it, it collapsed. This exuberant vacuum cleaner, if you want, system collapsed in 2008. And now the only thing that keeps the show on the road, so to speak, is on the one hand, central banks that have printed huge quantities of money that operates a bit like cortisone on a patient. Right. So it numbs you, it makes you feel a bit perky, but doesn't do away with the actual cause of the trouble. And China, because China has boosted its own credit creation magnificently in order to, and they've done a very good job. We owe them a debt of gratitude for having kept the rest of us in Europe and in America, they prevented us from turning the Great Recession into a Great Depression. Only small places like Greece are in the Great Depression. And now, we have the Donald in the White House threatening to torpedo the only good thing that we have left in the global economy, which is China. Is
this why President Obama, and I would love to talk to you about your experiences working with President Obama and Merkel, but is this why President Obama had put so much of a priority on Asian Pacific countries?
Well, you have to ask him. It would be a good explanation of why he did. But at the same time, President Obama did quite a lot of damage by attempting to encircle China with a new trade bloc that would exclude China. That was a gross error. Thankfully, that backfired, but regrettably, Obama has now been replaced by a president who is operating as if he's trying to put dynamite under what is left of a global equilibrium.
That a lot of people think within the Democratic Party, that TPP, the agreement you're mentioning, was ultimately what lost Hillary Clinton the election, meaning the areas of the country where the white working class voters that were former union members, she wasn't addressing this issue. She ran on a pro-TPP line when it was divisive in the Democratic Party. So it's interesting.
It didn't help.
It didn't help.
But I would personally think that Hillary Clinton lost primarily because of the way in which her soul, body, language, and whole existence was so heavily intertwined with Wall Street.
100%. You couldn't say. I think our audience will be clicking like exactly at that moment. So let's go to the moment when you were the finance minister of Greece. Austerity was being presented. There was a vote too.
Well, we had austerity.
You had austerity.
We had the worst austerity in the history of the world. Austerity like you've never imagined.
Can you describe for our audience what that was like for the average Greek citizen? We saw the pictures of the ATMs that were only giving out so much money.
That was in the summer of 2015. You have to really go back to 2010, when our state went bankrupt. A huge loan was given to the state so that we can pass it on to the German and the French banks, and the Greek, the weakest of the Greeks were effectively sacrificed on the altar of the bank bailouts, and it was done in a cruel and inhuman manner. So, just to give our audience an understanding, by the time the austerity drive had really taken hold, before I was elected, well before I was elected, 1 in 2 families didn't have anybody working in it. You just need to state that. 1 in 2 families had no one working in it. They simply survived on the basis of some pension, which was cut by 40%. 40%. Allow me to put it in a vulgar but very accurate term. Greece became the wet dream of libertarians. In the sense that, think about it.
Wow.
Think about it.
Yeah.
40% reduction in wages and pensions.
Right.
Yeah? 40%, not 4%. 40%.
Right.
Yeah. Number 1. Number 2, complete elimination of trades unions' rights. Gone. No collective bargaining, no limitation to what employers could do with labor.
And just to stop for a second there, how is that not protected? Constitutionally, under law, that would be impossible in the United States. They go very, very far and find every single nuance of the law to get around collective bargaining. But how is that even possible? It was just under austerity. It was surrendering of the law.
I like to rely on what people in authority used to tell me, even before I was minister. So, how could this pass through the Constitutional Court?
Right.
Yeah. Well, allow me to tell you what a constitutional judge said to me when I put this question to him. I took him to task, and I said, how could you possibly rule that those pieces of legislation that were rammed down the throat of the government by the lenders, how could you possibly rule that that was consistent with the Greek constitution? And his answer was, it was not consistent with the Greek constitution, but Giannis, I was a judge, and the government was coming to me, and they were saying to me, if you do not just turn a blind eye to the unconstitutionality of these pieces of legislation, the ATMs will stop working tomorrow, because our creditors will make sure through the European Central Bank that controls the liquidity of the Greek banks, that the ATMs will stop functioning tomorrow. So pure terror, pure blackmail. And lo and behold, after we were elected and I moved into the finance ministry, the 3rd day I was in the finance ministry, the president of the Eurogroup is the, if you want, the organ of the finance ministers of the Eurozone, but in reality, they are the deep establishment of the European Union, especially the monetary union. This gentleman, who was Holland's finance minister, and effectively the messenger boy of the German finance minister, came to my office. Third day, I moved into the office on the 27th of January 2015. He came to visit me on the 30th. We sat down and I was looking forward to a good working relationship with him. But it was not possible to have a working relationship because the first question he asked me, once we were alone, without the cameras, without the aides, after when the tete-a-tete started, he said to me, "So Yanis, what do you propose to do with the program?" That was the term used to describe the previous austerity deal and the bailouts and so on. The program that I had been elected to renegotiate. And I said, "Look, Jeroen, it's clear not working. This is why I was elected."
And you were elected with very large numbers, by the way. It was historic.
I was very surprised by the result on election night. And said, "Look, there is a program that I can understand you're committed to. You are committed to. And you should understand that I was elected to challenge it and to renegotiate it. So I have an idea. Why don't we sit down? Sensibly, rationally, in a collegial manner, and look at it, from, carte blanche, start from the beginning, and design a program that is good for both of us. You, the creditors, and us, the Greek government and the Greek people. Because if we allow this country to breathe again and to grow again, you're going to get more money back." Right. And the answer I got to this, I think, very moderate suggestion that we sit down and work together. And we sit together against the problem, not against one another, was verbatim: "This won't work. If you insist on renegotiating the program crashes and your banks will be closed by the end of the month." Now, that is a remarkable experience. In democratic Europe, you have a freshly elected government with a mandate that goes to its colleagues in Europe, or actually the colleagues come to Athens, offers to establish common ground, but instead of that, you effectively what I faced was a coup d'etat. Like, sign on the dotted line, forget your mandate, no negotiation, no discussion, or we will crush you by closing down your banks. Now, in 1967, I mean, you're too young to remember that. You are, but I'm not. We had a coup d'etat in Greece. The tanks rolled on the streets of Athens and a democratically elected government was crushed. This time we had exactly the same thing with the banks. By the end of my tenure, this is why I resigned, they did close down the banks, and my colleague, friend, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, unfortunately, to the detriment both of the country and of himself, I think, his legacy, surrendered and signed on that dotted line. And this is why I'm not in the government anymore.
What would have been the alternative? I mean, they were going to shut down the banks anyways, and at that point.
The official version, if you ask Alexis Tsipras, my friend who still is the Prime Minister and with whom we fell out as a result of his surrender, what I call his surrender, he will say to you that, look, we really struggled, we put up a good fight, they closed down the banks, we faced an ironclad set of creditors. If we insisted on not signing on the dotted line, they would have kept the banks shut forever, and they would have thrown us out of the Eurozone. We would have to create our own currency, it would be chaos, the country would have sunk into a hole. That's what he would say to you. What I will say is that, well, this is what we were elected to do. The one promise of substance that we made to the Greek people is that we're not going to get another loan until our debt is restructured and made viable. And in the end, 2 points. First, being thrown out of the Eurozone and forced to create our own currency would be very painful, but it would be a short, sharp shock. By now we would be recovering and we would be free of the shackles of the debt bondage that now threaten to keep Greece in a state of desertification for the next 40 years. So even if they had thrown us out, in the end it would have been better than surrender. That's my view. And the second point is, if he stood tall, and if he had stuck to our guns, and we did this together, the creditors would have relented. Because throwing us out of the Eurozone would have cost them 1 trillion euros, and I can actually do the calculation for you. And they would not have done that. So it was an empty threat in the end.
That's how it appeared from the outside, from the progressive outside. That's
how it was.
It just seemed like it was a loss and it was a bluff, and it's like when the Republicans are negotiating with Donald Trump and they put up, in the end, they rely on Donald Trump, so they don't have that much leverage over him in many ways. So moving on, I mean, we see what's happening in Puerto Rico. We've had a huge populist wave across the globe since you resigned. You had elections across the globe. Also a rise of fascism. I only wonder at what point they're going to relent and say, okay, we're willing to pull back a little bit. What we see in Puerto Rico is a catastrophe. Absolutely. And it is fully attributed at this point to a conservative element, at least in America, that is they're completely stripping. They're not even sending aid to Puerto Rico. So they're doubling down on a horrible concept, a horrible idea, furthering the point that the strategy.
They've installed a government of bailiffs.
Exactly.
Which is exactly what they did in Greece, right? Because you have to remember, we don't have a Greek government. We have something looking like a Greek government, but the real government is, like in Puerto Rico, a fiscal council, a troika of lenders that effectively write all the laws. They pass laws that are translated by Google Translate, because they're written in English and sent to the Greek Parliament.
Are you serious?
Oh, absolutely. When I was in there, when I was still a member of Parliament, I remember receiving 1,000 pages, the terms and conditions of surrender by the troika. And I just couldn't read it. It was in Greek, but it didn't make any sense. And I realized that it was translated by something like Google Translate. I'm not sure it was Google Translate, but it could be. So I used my connections with Brussels to get the English version, to understand what the hell it was saying. But you're absolutely right. But I remember in my meetings with the great and the good in Brussels, in Frankfurt, I would often say to them, look, I understand you. You don't want to have somebody like me to be dealing with, because you're used to having somebody who says yes. And I come from the left. My party, Syriza, means coalition of the radical left. This is all an abomination for you. I understand that. I respect that. But trust me, we are Democrats. We are Europeanists. We are internationalists. We are not bigots and we are not nationalists. We do not care just about Greece. We care about Germany as well. We care about France. With us, you can have, if we strike common ground, if we establish common ground or strike a decent, mutually advantageous deal, in the end, everybody's going to benefit. You, us, and if you crush us, the only thing you should expect is political monsters breeding in this atmosphere of despondency that our crashing will create. And lo and behold, this is what's happening. It was not great prophecy. It was evident. Similarly, in the United States, Bernie Sanders was robbed by the Democratic National Committee.
Now, as of yesterday.
Yeah, I don't care whether it's official or not. I'm not being paid enough to lie. Bernie Sanders was crushed, and look at what the result is. Right. And it's the same on both sides of the Atlantic.
And you see these movements on both sides, whether the far-right nationalist movement is as large as it, there's the movement and then there's the power. Whereas the left is a large movement, at least in the United States, it's a very large movement. Those who believe in a lot of these economic values like Medicare for all, $15 minimum wage, the list goes on and on. It's the majority of Americans.
But we're terrible at binding together.
That's it.
Yeah? And you look, for decades, I grew up as part of the left. Everywhere I lived, in Britain, in Australia, in America, in Greece. We of the left always fall back to the fallacy that the reason why we cannot combine forces to make change that is good for the many is because the establishment is so strong and so powerful and undermines us. Rubbish. Right. Donald Trump proved that you can go against the establishment and win. What we lack as the left, as progressives, is ambition and a capacity to overcome the mentality, I don't know whether this is popular in this country, the opening scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, when there is a Judean People's Front whose greatest enemy is the Liberation Front of Judea and not the Romans. So we are exactly the same. We are fantastic at starting major skirmishes between progressives,
right,
and not binding together the way that the right has always bound together.
And it's smoke and mirrors, because if you look at the numbers, at least in the United States, I would argue globally, the far right is, the ideology is catching fire, but it is not, meaning the nationalist, fascist elements. It's catching fire, but it's not growing at the same rate. And it's nowhere near the numbers. And so when I think about the future of this global movement, I mean, there's a difference between maybe past movements. It is much more interconnected. You're sitting here on a couch with me talking about the global left, speaking to YouTube, and millions of people hopefully will watch this. That wasn't possible. The media had they held this conversation as if this is what's true.
We have no excuse now.
We have no excuse
we have
now.
to do. We did it in Greece.
You did.
Well, that's how we were elected. We were not elected because the media liked us.
Right.
In July of 2015, when we called the referendum and put to the people of Greece the ultimatum that came from the creditors, every television channel was portraying those of us who were recommending a no to the creditors'
right,
ultimatum as the apostles of Armageddon, the evil priests, and the fake news everywhere, and toxic attitude towards all of those who supported the no vote. And we won 62% of the vote.
And it was portrayed that way here as well. This message carried through.
So it can be done.
True.
It can be done.
Jeremy Corbyn experienced the same thing.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Didn't get any endorsements until
Absolutely.
the week before. So with that, it seems like we're so much closer. And what reassurance can we have at this point when you have Donald Trump a fascist, when you have Theresa May, when you have people still gaining power or maybe losing power if they're making terrible mistakes like Donald Trump is? What do we do to overcome this hump?
I believe we need to do two things, and this is what we're doing with the movement that I am very proud to be a member of, DiEM25 in Europe. Two things. Firstly, modernize and recover the spirit of the New Deal. The idea that during a deflationary, stagnationist period in the history of capitalism, FDR did this after 1929, which was that generation's 2008. We need to do it in the aftermath of our generation's 1929, 2008. We need to put the financial genie back into the bottle, but seriously this time, not the way Obama did. And even that is now being undone by Trump. Secondly, we need to energize idle savings, because we have this remarkable paradox. At a time when most people are indebted and have very, very low wages, we have the highest level of savings in proportion to incomes in the history of capitalism, and the lowest level of investment. So we have a lot of idle cash doing nothing but damage by bidding up house prices in New York, in London,
right,
bidding up share prices, but not being invested into the things humanity needs, and the lowest level of investment. So what was the New Deal all about? It was about picking up, pushing investment up. So we need to do this to reconstitute the spirit of the New Deal on both sides of the Atlantic, hopefully. And the second dimension, internationalism or transnationalism. What we're trying to do in Europe with DiEM25, we have set out to create the first pan-European transnational movement, not a confederacy of different progressive forces, one movement where we all belong to as progressives, whether we're German, Portuguese, British, French, or Greeks, to that one movement, and put to voters across Europe what we call our European New Deal, which is the result of 2 years of working on what I was saying before, reconstituting the spirit of the New Deal and modernizing it and bringing to it the capacities that new technologies and the lessons of the last 100 years have provided us with, to re-inject hope and to break down the nationalisms and the antagonisms between, German workers and Greek workers and so on. It would be splendid if something like this happened in the Americas. I look forward to a democracy in the Americas movement, to which you will have citizens of the United States, Canadians, Mexicans, Colombians, all the way down to Chile, belonging to the same movement. This is the best antidote to the US-Mexican border wall. It's the best antidote to the idea that it's us against them, that America is exceptional and very different to every other place. Look, capital is unified. They have enormous empathy and solidarity for one another. They don't care, bankers don't care whether they are German, American, Canadian, Singaporean. They operate as one. Isn't it about time we progressives did the same thing?
I mean, the Third Way did it. They worked with the capitalists and the neoliberal philosophy. They went across the globe and built relationships and had summits. And I mean, it was all above board. It was, everyone would say, oh, this is conspiracy. No, it's in history. They actually...
So, class consciousness.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, there's only a couple more questions I have that, looking forward, there is the Band-Aid, there's the remedy, there's getting us out of this global mess and fighting off fascism, but then there's the coming technology, right? Automation is brought up quite a bit, even in progressive circles. How do we deal with workers when automation is bound to happen? It's an issue globally.
It has been since the Industrial Revolution. Only now it's taking a new turn, because for the first time we have technologies that destroy more jobs than they create. It is clear that, let's be optimistic. I mean, there are so many reasons to be pessimistic, but just for the sake of it, let's look at all this hopefully. We of the left have failed to undermine capitalism and to replace it with socialism. There's no doubt that we are massive historical failures, for the last 100 years or so. But capitalism is fantastic at undermining itself, at producing all the technologies that make corporate capital, for instance, increasingly obsolete. Think about the combination of the 3D printer, the internet, artificial intelligence, robots that will become increasingly cheap to produce, will destroy economies of scale. And what's the point of a corporation if there are no economies of scale? Suddenly its raison d'etre collapses. Now the problem, of course, is what is going to follow capitalism. It won't necessarily be the good society, it could be a dystopia. So what follows capitalism depends on politics. It depends on whether we manage to create a genuine democracy. Or we allow the oligarchy to continue to control the robots. Because if they do, they will be their own gravediggers, in a sense, because, think about it, the robots will not be purchasing the products of the robots. So who's going to be keeping up the profit rates of the 0.01%? Right. No one. So technology, we must love it, espouse it, promote it. At the same time, we have to make sure that we democratize it and socialize it. So this is our task as progressives and as the left. We are not going to overthrow capitalism because it is doing a very good job at overthrowing itself. What we need to do is pave the ground for a good society resulting once capital has undermined capitalism.
What's your timeline?
2019 is for us in Europe and DiEM25 a pivotal year for a number of reasons. Firstly, because Brexit is happening, and this is going to have serious repercussions across Europe. Secondly, because we have European Parliament elections. The European Parliament is a non-issue. But the European Parliament elections are very important because imagine we have, on one day, 1 week, we have elections happening all the way from Finland to Portugal, from Ireland to Greece. And it's a fantastic opportunity for our progressive pan-European transnational movement to put our European New Deal to Europeans in every polling station across Europe and begin the debate. Because the one thing that we really need to dissolve is the toxic dogma of Tina, that there is no alternative. And so 2019 is on our radar screen now. And then the next, I think, if you want, marker on the timeline is 2024, 2025, because by then, it's my estimation, I may be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, the European Union is not going to be able to reproduce itself after that. Its fragmentation is going to be at a very advanced stage, and the only people who are going to benefit from that are the racists, the bigots, the Hungarian government, the Polish government that are moving in the direction of what they call illiberal democracy. As far as this country is concerned, this is your task.
That's quite a task. What role does Russia have in all of this?
Very little.
Okay.
This country has gone crazy.
Yes, they
Russia.
have.
But I think that this
is scared.
I think that's the Democratic Party trying to find a scapegoat. Instead of owning up to the fact that they lost the trust of the American people, they're trying to blame it on Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin would have loved to interfere in your elections and to wreak havoc in this country, but he's not strong enough. Russia is a fading power. Its economy is bankrupt. Its demography is shrinking. It's increasingly insignificant. The only reason why geopolitically it revived slightly was because of the blunders of American foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, allowing Putin back into Syria, especially after the Iraq War, which was a complete catastrophe for the West. And not to mention, of course, the people in the Middle East. I'm not worried about Russia. I'm worried about Europe and the United States, because these are very wealthy, very powerful economic blocs, and both of them are ungovernable. And you have China trying to keep the balance in the global economy. They're behaving very sensibly, even though they're authoritarian and they have people in prison. But nevertheless, of the three economic blocs, great powers, America, Europe, China. China is the only source of reason. You put together the words European foreign policy and you end up with a joke. There's no such thing. The United States, what do I need to say? I mean, I heard that President Trump is about to visit Asia, and I think, oh my God, don't, stay at home. You will do damage even if you don't want to. So yeah, I'm worried about our neck of the woods.
Okay.
Our own homelands.
It is played up, I mean, it's played up into mainstream, where if you don't recognize Russia, you're part of the extremists. But I have to say, and this is something I'm very proud of, before politics, before my political engagement, when I was still just a professor at the University of Athens, I very proudly vetoed the award of an honorary doctorate to Vladimir Putin. That was in 2001. Wow. I was the only one who voted against 2001, and I actually justified my veto by saying that he's a war criminal. He was a KGB.
That's not the problem.
Ooh,
no, the problem for me was that he's a war criminal. He flattened Chechnya. Right. He destroyed Grozny. Mm-hmm. He's responsible for the death of tens of thousands of people. In a phony war that he engineered in order to become president of Russia. Mm-hmm. So make no mistake, I'm not his apologist.
Oh no, I wasn't saying that.
But to say that Putin now is an issue in the United States and that it is a great threat to the democratic process in the United States, it is just an appalling attempt to abrogate one's responsibility.
As David Axelrod said, the campaign should have never been so close that a couple of Facebook ads or a couple hundred Facebook ads in Wisconsin would make a difference. And I think that's, from my perspective, the way that Putin has looked at this. And
I think that the Democratic Party is making a very big mistake, denigrating those who voted for Trump by saying to them that they are idiots that fell in the trap of Vladimir Putin. It is a gross error to be avoided. Like a plague, mm-hmm. to belittle those who voted for people like Trump. People vote for bigots only because they're angry and they feel discarded. and because they feel abandoned. So the way to bring them back to the fold of civilization is not to antagonize them, not to belittle them, but to show that you are worthy of their trust. And the Democratic Party has not shown that.
I agree. Okay, last question. Do you plan on running again?
If I have to, I'd like not to. Like I didn't like running the first time around, back in 2015. I see political office as a major chore. But I believe that anyone who doesn't see political office as a chore should be disqualified from running. Anybody who really wants to be congressman or senator or president for that matter, they need to have their head examined. Why would you want to do that? Of course, somebody has to do it. So you should only do it as public service for a limited time period and then say, okay, guys, now somebody else. And if you love it, then it means that you're power hungry and ready to fall in the lap of the insiders and of the establishment.
There you have it. Perfect. I think we have a few sound bites here.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Ευχαριστώ.
Παρακαλώ.
Okay.